The emergency alarm hit my quarters at the 3rd hour of the deep cycle, and the sound alone told me this was not about the Krael. I had lived through 3 years of war alerts, and each of them carried a specific tone, a specific rhythm, a specific weight. This alarm was different. This alarm was older. It came from the priority channel that the Grand Council reserved for existential threats, the channel we had not used in 80 years. I pulled myself from my resting chamber and felt the cold of the station floor beneath my feet. My name is Vathan Saurus, and I have served as High Counselor of the Galactic Accord for 214 years. In all that time, I have answered perhaps 6 alerts from the priority channel. Every single one of them involved the same species: humans. I dressed quickly and made my way through the corridors of Central Station. The usual night cycle calm had vanished. Aides from a dozen different species rushed past me, their eyes wide, their movements sharp with fear. A Dranathi attaché nearly knocked me sideways and did not even stop to apologize. Her face was the color of cold ash, and she was whispering something under her breath, the same word over and over, though she was moving too fast for me to catch it. A pair of Gorvan security officers stood at the junction of the East Corridor, speaking in rapid whispers, their massive clawed hands gripping their ceremonial staves so tightly that the metal was bending. These were creatures that could shatter stone with a casual swipe, and they looked like they wanted to hide. I reached the Grand Chamber in under 4 minutes. Every senior counselor was already there, every single one. This alone was unprecedented. In 2 centuries, I had never seen the full council assembled during the deep cycle. Not during the Pellic border crisis, not during the Shivan Civil War, not during the first 3 years of the Krael invasion, when entire worlds were falling and our fleets were burning across 100 systems. Counselor Prin of the Olesi sat rigid in her hovering platform, her 4 eyes darting from face to face. Her crystalline skin had gone dim, a sign of severe distress in her species, and the musical harmonics that usually accompanied her speech had gone flat and discordant. Counselor Bach of the Tuvani was pacing behind his delegation's bench, his heavy tail dragging grooves into the polished floor, his broad face darkened to the deep rust color that indicated barely controlled rage. Even Counselor Shorath of the Mavine, who was over 400 years old and had not attended a night session in living memory, was present. She was seated in her life support cradle, her withered hands folded on the armrest, her ancient eyes open and alert. She looked like she had not slept in days. The chamber was filled with the sound of too many species talking at once, and all of them were saying the same thing in different languages. Someone has contacted Earth. I took my seat and activated my terminal. The briefing file was already loaded, and as I read through it, I felt something I had not felt since I was a young aide standing in this very chamber 80 years ago. I felt genuine, bone-deep dread. The facts were simple. A junior delegate from the Fenari Compact, a small species whose homeworld bordered the Krael war zone, had sent a formal plea for military intervention. This was not unusual. We received dozens of such pleas every cycle. The Krael Dominion had been grinding through Accord territory for 3 years, swallowing worlds one by one, and the smaller species were desperate. Their colonies were burning. Their populations were being scattered or worse. Every few days, another plea arrived, begging the Council for more ships, more weapons, more anything. What made this plea different? What had triggered the priority alarm and dragged every senior counselor from their rest was not the content, it was the destination. The Fenari delegate had not sent the plea to the Council. He had not sent it to the Combined Defense Authority. He had not sent it to any of the 12 species with active military fleets. He had sent it to Earth. I closed the file and looked around the chamber. The arguments had already started. Counselor Prin was demanding to know how a junior delegate had even obtained the communication protocols for Earth's embassy. Those protocols were classified at the highest level. They were not distributed to minor species. They were not stored on public networks. Getting them would have required either a catastrophic security breach or deliberate assistance from someone with high-level clearance. Counselor Bach was insisting that the plea could be retracted, intercepted, erased before the humans ever processed it. He was wrong, and somewhere in the part of his mind that was not consumed by panic, he knew he was wrong, But he kept saying it anyway because the alternative was admitting that the situation was already beyond our control. A Fenari representative, a terrified young creature with pale green skin and trembling hands, was trying to explain that the delegate had acted alone, without authorization, out of pure desperation. His colony had been under Krael bombardment for 11 months. His family was in the shelters. He had tried every official channel. He had begged the Council for help. He had begged the Combined Defense Authority. He had begged the 12 fleet species individually. Nobody had come. Nobody had been able to come. And so, in the darkest hour of his desperation, he had reached out to the one species that nobody wanted to talk about. I let them argue for exactly 90 seconds. Then I stood, and the chamber went quiet. That is the privilege of being the oldest serving counselor. When I stand, people listen. Not because I am wise, because I am old enough to remember what happened the last time Earth got involved in galactic affairs. I asked the question that no one wanted to hear. Has the plea been received? The communications director, a Gorvan named Tasik, checked his terminal and then checked it again. He ran a verification sequence. He ran a second verification sequence. Then he looked up at me with an expression I had seen on soldiers returning from the front lines. The expression of someone who has seen something they cannot process and does not know how to put it into words. The plea was received by Earth's embassy on Central Station 4 hours ago, he said. It was forwarded to their homeworld 2 hours ago. We have confirmation of receipt from their capital, a city called Geneva. The chamber erupted. I have seen panic in this room before. I have seen counselors scream at each other over trade disputes and border conflicts and resource shortages. But I have never seen anything like the reaction to those words. Counselor Bach slammed his fist into his bench so hard that the wood cracked down the middle. 3 delegates from the Shivan hegemony simply stood up and walked out without a word, their faces blank, their eyes unfocused. The Fenari representative collapsed into his seat and put his head in his hands. 2 Alessiades began keening, a high-pitched sound of distress that their species used when facing situations beyond hope. Even the Gorvan security officers at the chamber doors shifted their weight and exchanged glances that carried the unmistakable weight of fear. I remained standing because someone had to. We need to contact Earth's embassy immediately, I said. My voice carried across the chaos, and heads turned toward me. We need to formally disavow the plea, clarify that it was unauthorized, and request that they disregard it. Every head in the room turned toward me. For a moment, I saw something close to hope in their eyes. Of course, the old counselor would know what to do. The old counselor had dealt with humans before. The old counselor would fix this. I could feel the weight of their expectations settling onto my shoulders like a physical burden, pressing me down, demanding that I carry them to safety. I did not tell them that I had no idea if this could be fixed. I did not tell them that in my experience, asking humans to disregard suffering was like asking a river to flow uphill. You could make the request, but the river would do what the river was going to do. The session dissolved into emergency planning. A diplomatic team was assembled in minutes. I would lead it. I had the most experience with human interactions, which meant I had spoken to a human ambassador exactly 3 times in my career and had found each conversation more unsettling than the last. Humans were polite, they were warm, they were remarkably easy to talk to, and they were utterly impossible to read. Every other species in the galaxy broadcast their intentions through body language, through pheromones, through the subtle electromagnetic shifts that accompanied emotional states. Humans did none of this. They smiled, and nodded, and said reasonable things, and then they did whatever they had already decided to do. But 3 times was more than anyone else in the chamber, so the task fell to me. As we prepared to leave, Counselor Shorath caught my arm. Her grip was weak, the strength in her ancient body long since faded, but the pressure of her fingers carried a significance that no words could match. She was the only other person in the room who had been alive during the last time Earth involved itself in a galactic conflict. She had been a young counselor then, newly appointed, standing where I had stood, watching from a viewport as the galaxy changed. "Tell me truthfully, Vathan," she said. Her voice was thin but perfectly clear, each word precisely chosen. "Can you stop them?" I looked at her and gave her the only honest answer I had. I do not know. I do not think anyone has ever stopped humans from doing something they have decided to do. She released my arm and sat back in her cradle. Her eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with intelligence, held mine for a long moment. Then you had better hope they have not decided yet, she said. I walked through the corridors of Central Station toward the embassy wing. My diplomatic team followed behind me, 4 junior aides from 4 different species, all of them young enough that they had never dealt with humans directly. They only knew the stories, the warnings, the classified briefings that every new counselor received on their first day, the ones with the red seals and the single-word header that simply read, Earth. Every species we passed in the corridor moved out of our path. Not out of respect for my rank. They could see where we were heading, and they wanted to be nowhere near Earth's door when it opened. I reached the embassy wing. The corridor was long and lined with doors, each one leading to the diplomatic quarters of a different species. The Olesi embassy was decorated with crystal lattices that sang softly in the ventilation currents, casting prismatic light across the walls. The Gorvan embassy had massive stone doors carved with scenes of ancient hunts, the carvings worn smooth by centuries of touching hands. The Tuvani embassy smelled of salt water and warm sand, and if you pressed your ear to the door, you could hear the simulated sound of waves. Earth's embassy was at the end of the corridor. It was the only embassy with no decorations on its exterior. The door was plain gray metal, smooth and featureless, fitted with a locking mechanism that our security teams had never been able to identify. Behind that door was the only space on Central Station that operated on its own independent power grid, the only space with its own atmospheric processing system, the only space that our sensors could not penetrate, no matter how advanced the scanning technology we employed. We had tried everything over the years: resonance imaging, quantum field mapping, gravitonic sonar. Nothing worked. The walls of Earth's embassy were opaque to every form of sensing technology in the known galaxy. I had asked a human diplomat once, years ago, why their embassy needed its own power supply. She had smiled at me and said, "In case yours goes out." At the time, I had thought it was a joke. Later, much later, I realized it was the most honest thing any human had ever said to me. They were always prepared for everything to fail around them. It was, I had come to understand, a fundamental feature of their species. They expected the worst and built accordingly. I stood before the door. My team stood behind me. I could feel their anxiety like heat radiating from a furnace. I pressed the communication panel beside the door. A soft chime sounded, musical and oddly pleasant. A voice answered, clear, warm, speaking perfect galactic standard, with just a trace of an accent. "Hi, Counselor Saurus. We have been expecting you. Please come in." The door opened. Behind it was warmth, light, and the smell of something I could not identify. Something alive and growing, and impossibly out of place on a space station. I stepped through the door, and the heavy metal closed behind me, with a sound like a seal locking into place. There was no going back. The interior of Earth's embassy was nothing like any other diplomatic space on Central Station. Where the Olesi favored crystal and light, and the Gorvan preferred stone and shadow, the humans had filled their space with things that grew. Plants of a dozen varieties lined the walls in ceramic containers, their leaves broad and green, and reaching toward the artificial sunlight that streamed from panels in the ceiling. The floor was covered in a woven material, soft under my feet, patterned with geometric designs in deep reds and golds. Music played from somewhere I could not see, a slow, rhythmic composition built around instruments I did not recognize, strings and percussion, and a low, resonant voice humming a melody that seemed to follow no mathematical structure I could identify, yet somehow felt inevitable. The gravity was wrong, heavier than station standard by at least 12%. Earth gravity. My legs felt the difference immediately, a subtle increase in effort with every step, a constant reminder that this was not my environment. The temperature was wrong too, several degrees warmer than the carefully maintained neutral climate of the corridors. Within 30 seconds, I was perspiring through my ceremonial robes. My aides shifted uncomfortably behind me, adjusting to the pressure and the heat. The human ambassador was waiting for us in the main reception room. She sat in a simple chair behind a simple desk, and the simplicity of it was somehow more intimidating than any throne I had ever seen. Her name was Claire Harmon. She was, by human standards, a woman of middle years, with dark skin and dark eyes, and closely cut gray hair. She wore a formal suit in dark blue, unadorned except for a small pin on her collar that bore the symbol of Earth's unified government. A circle containing a representation of their planet, blue and green, and impossibly small against the darkness of space. She was smiling. In 200 years of diplomacy, I have learned to read the expressions of over 40 different species. I can tell when a Gorvan is bluffing by the way their dorsal ridges flatten. I can tell when an Olesi is hiding grief by the shift in their crystal resonance. I can tell when a Tuvani is about to break a negotiation by the temperature change in their skin. But I have never been able to read humans. Their faces move in ways that seem open and transparent, and yet I have never once been certain what a human is actually thinking. They have more facial muscles than almost any species in the galaxy, and they use every single one of them to construct expressions that look genuine and reveal nothing. Claire Harmon's smile could have meant anything. "Please, sit down, counselor," she said, gesturing to a set of chairs arranged across from her desk. She looked at my aides. "All of you. I have tea, if you would like some." Tea. She was offering us tea. The galaxy might be about to change forever, and this woman was offering us a hot beverage brewed from dried leaves. I sat. My aides sat. One of them, a young Shivan named Kellis, accepted the tea with shaking hands. I noticed that the cup was warm against his cold-blooded skin, and he held it with both hands, as if grateful for the heat. I noticed too that the cup was perfectly sized for Shivan hands, which were much smaller than human hands. She had cups designed for other species. She had been prepared for visitors. She had known we were coming before we did. "Ambassador Harmon," I began, and she held up one hand gently. "Claire, please. I have never been comfortable with titles." I adjusted. "Claire, I am here on behalf of the full Galactic Council regarding an unauthorized communication that may have been received by your embassy in the last several hours. I want to assure you that this communication was not sanctioned by the Council, was not endorsed by the Fenari Compact's senior government, and does not represent the official position of the Galactic Accord. We formally request that it be disregarded." I delivered the words with every ounce of diplomatic authority I possessed. I made them sound reasonable, measured, official. I made them sound like the natural and expected response to an administrative error. She listened to every word. She nodded at the appropriate moments. She maintained eye contact without blinking, which I knew from my briefings was a human behavior associated with sincerity, but which, to my species, felt like the fixed gaze of a predator tracking prey. When I finished, she folded her hands on the desk. Her smile had not changed. "Counselor," she said, "I appreciate you coming here personally. I know this was not an easy walk for you, and I want to be respectful of the Council's position." She paused. Something shifted behind her eyes, a calculation, a decision being made in real time, and I felt a cold sensation spread through my circulatory system, because I knew, in that instant, that she was about to tell me something I did not want to hear. "I should be transparent with you," she continued. "We received the Fenari plea 6 hours before your emergency session began. I forwarded it to Geneva 3 hours ago. I have already received preliminary instructions from my government." The room went cold. Not the temperature. The temperature was still uncomfortably warm, but something in the air changed, something in the quality of the silence, and I felt my circulatory system constrict in a way it had not done since I was a young male facing my first territorial challenge on the breeding grounds of my homeworld. She had forwarded it before we even knew about it. Earth's government had been processing this for hours while we were still scrambling to assemble our council. They were already ahead of us. They had been ahead of us from the moment the plea was sent. I shifted my approach. I had prepared for this possibility, though I had hoped desperately that I would not need to use it. "Claire," I said, carefully modulating my voice to project calm authority, "I understand that the plea reached you through legitimate channels. However, I urge you to consider the practical realities of the situation. The Creole conflict is located far from human space. Earth has no strategic interest in the war zone. Involvement would require significant resource expenditure, with no tangible benefit to your people. The Galactic Accord is fully capable of managing this conflict through existing mechanisms. Every word of that was a lie, and she knew it. And she knew that I knew she knew it. The Galactic Accord was not fully capable of managing the conflict. We were losing. The Kral had taken 63 systems in 3 years. Our combined fleets were stretched to breaking. 2 species had already begun quiet negotiations for separate peace, hoping to save themselves by abandoning their allies. 3 more were considering it. Within a year, perhaps less, the Accord would fracture, and the Kral would devour us piece by piece. But I said it anyway, because the alternative was admitting that we needed help from the one species in the galaxy that terrified us more than the enemy at our gates. Claire listened. She agreed with every practical point I raised. Yes, the war was far from Earth. Yes, involvement would be costly. Yes, there was no strategic incentive. She agreed so thoroughly and so reasonably that for one foolish, hopeful moment, I thought she might actually be persuaded. Then she touched a control on her desk, and a holographic display materialized between us. It showed text, a document, the Finari plea itself. She scrolled through it slowly, her dark eyes scanning the words with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. She found a specific passage and stopped. She did not read it aloud. She simply turned the display so that I could see the words clearly. It was a description of conditions on Finari Colony 7, a world that had been under Kral bombardment for 11 months. The passage described shelters carved into bedrock, where 300,000 civilians lived in permanent darkness, while the surface above them was reduced to glass and ash. It described food supplies that had run out 2 months ago. It described medical facilities operating without power, without supplies, without trained personnel, performing surgeries by the light of chemical lamps, because the generators had been destroyed. It described the rationing of water, of air, of hope. It described children who had been born in those shelters and had never seen the sky. I read the passage. I felt my throat tighten in a way that I had trained myself, over 2 centuries, to suppress. I had read reports from the front lines. I had reviewed casualty figures. I had signed authorizations for refugee relocations and emergency supply drops that I knew would never arrive. But this was different. This was not a report. This was a voice. A single, desperate voice, describing the end of a world. Claire turned the display back toward herself. She was no longer smiling. "You understand," she said quietly, "that we cannot simply choose not to respond to this." I looked at her across the desk, across the gap between her species and mine, across the enormous distance between what I wanted and what I feared. And I played my last card. I said the word that I knew would change the tone of this conversation entirely. I said, "Remember the adjustment." The warmth vanished from her face. Not slowly, not gradually. It disappeared in an instant, like a light being switched off. And for 1 second I saw something behind her eyes that I recognized. Not anger, not offense. Something older and deeper and infinitely more complicated. Shame, perhaps, or grief. Or the weight of a history that her species carried the way mine carried our homeworld's gravity. Always present, always pulling, impossible to escape. Then she spoke, and her voice was level and controlled in a way that told me she was choosing each word with surgical precision. "Counselor Saurus," she said, "the adjustment is precisely why we take these things seriously now." I did not fully understand what she meant. I would, later. But in that moment, sitting in that warm room surrounded by growing things and the smell of earth tea, I simply recognized that I had lost. Every argument I had brought into this room had been met, absorbed, and set aside. Not dismissed, not rejected. Simply acknowledged and moved past, the way a river acknowledges a stone and flows around it. I stood. I thanked her for her time. I led my team out of the embassy and back through the heavy gray door into the corridor of Central Station. The door sealed behind us with that same sound, that same finality, like a chapter closing in a book that could not be unwritten. My aides looked at me. Kellis still held his teacup. His hands had stopped shaking, but his eyes were wide and his breathing was rapid. The others were in various states of controlled distress, their species-specific stress responses playing out in twitching antennae, dimming skin, and the faint chemical signatures of fear pheromones. I activated my communication device and contacted the Grand Chamber directly. The entire council was still assembled, still waiting, still hoping that the old counselor had fixed everything. I delivered my report in a single sentence. They know. They are considering it. Prepare for the possibility that they will say yes. I closed the channel before anyone could respond. Then I stood in the corridor for a long moment, breathing the clean, neutral, carefully regulated air of Central Station, and I pulled up a file on my personal terminal that I had not opened in decades. The file carried a red seal. The header was a single word: Earth. Beneath it, in smaller text, was the formal designation that the Galactic Accord had given to the events of 80 years ago. The events that had reshaped every species' understanding of what humans were and what they were capable of. The adjustment. I opened the file because the younger counselors in that chamber had no idea what was coming. They had read the summaries, they had seen the statistics, but they had not been there. They had not stood on the observation deck of a space station and watched a human fleet do the impossible. I had been there. I was 26 years old, a junior aide carrying documents for a counselor whose name I could barely remember, and I had watched through a viewport as the galaxy learned a lesson it would never forget. I needed to read the file so that I could explain it to the people who were about to ask me what the adjustment actually meant. Because the briefings did not capture it, the statistics did not capture it, the carefully worded diplomatic summaries did not come close to capturing the reality of what had happened when humanity went to war. The file was worse than I remembered. It opened with a date, Galactic Standard Year 4417, 80 years before the present day. The location was a fringe world called Kessler's Reach, a small colony on the outer edge of human-claimed space. The colony had a population of approximately 40,000 humans, mostly researchers and agricultural workers, who had settled the planet for its unusual soil composition, which supported Earth crops with minimal modification. It was a quiet place, a farming community on the edge of nowhere, the kind of place that no one thought about until it became the most important world in the galaxy. The file documented, in dry bureaucratic language that somehow made the contents more disturbing rather than less, how a coalition of 4 species decided that Kessler's Reach was strategically valuable: the Vrethan hegemony, the Dorsal Combine, the Pellic Union, and a now-defunct military alliance called the Stenari Pact. 4 species, each with established military forces, each with centuries of experience in territorial acquisition. They looked at Kessler's Reach and saw a poorly defended colony on the edge of human space, far from Earth's core systems, with no significant military presence. They calculated that the cost of taking the colony would be minimal and the benefit substantial. They were correct about the benefit. They were catastrophically wrong about the cost. I remembered the first reports that reached Central Station. The coalition had deployed a combined fleet of 800 warships against Kessler's Reach. 800 ships against a colony with a defensive garrison of 12 patrol vessels and a ground force of approximately 2,000 militia members. Not soldiers, militia, farmers and researchers who trained on weekends and kept their weapons in storage lockers. The projected timeline for the operation was 72 hours. The projected human casualties were listed as acceptable. The projected coalition casualties were listed as negligible. The battle lasted 4 months. I read through the file slowly, letting the details settle into my mind, like stones sinking into deep water. The first phase went according to the coalition's plan. They overwhelmed the patrol vessels within hours. They established orbital control. They began landing ground forces. Everything proceeded exactly as their strategists had predicted. Then the humans adapted. The file contained intercepted communications from the coalition's field commanders, and reading them again after 80 years, I felt the same chill I had felt the first time. The tone of those communications changed over the course of the first week, in a way that was almost physically painful to follow. The early messages were confident, routine, professional. By day 4, they were confused. By day 7, they were alarmed. By day 10, they were requesting reinforcements. By day 14, they were begging for them. The problem, as the coalition commanders gradually and then suddenly understood, was that humans did not fight the way other species fought. Every known civilization in the galaxy approached warfare as a rational exercise. You calculated your objectives, you assessed your resources, you projected your losses. When the projected losses exceeded the value of the objective, you withdrew. This was not cowardice, this was mathematics. Every species understood this. Every species operated this way. It was so fundamental to galactic military doctrine that nobody questioned it. It was like gravity. You did not question gravity. Humans did not follow this mathematics. The 40,000 colonists on Kessler's Reach did not calculate acceptable losses. They did not weigh the strategic value of their world against the cost of defending it. They did not conduct cost-benefit analyses or projected casualty assessments. They simply refused to stop fighting. The militia, outnumbered by a factor of hundreds, outgunned by generations of technology, dissolved into the terrain and began conducting operations that the coalition had no framework to counter. They struck supply convoys, they ambushed patrols, they sabotaged landing zones, they mined roads, they rigged buildings. They turned every structure, every tunnel, every river crossing, every stretch of forest into a threat that could not be predicted or neutralized. And they learned. This was the detail in the file that frightened me most, then and now. Human commanders would encounter a new coalition tactic, and within days, sometimes within hours, develop a counter-tactic that exploited weaknesses the coalition did not know it had. They would capture equipment and reverse engineer modifications within a single day. They would observe coalition troop movements and predict patrol routes with an accuracy that the coalition's own officers could not match. They shared information across their scattered units with a speed and efficiency that the coalition's intelligence analysts could not explain, using communication methods that the coalition could not intercept, adapt to, or even identify. The coalition reinforced. They brought in another 400 ships. They deployed ground forces from all 4 species, including elite units with decades of combat experience. They adapted their own tactics to counter the human resistance. The humans adapted faster. They always adapted faster. It was as if the pressure of the conflict sharpened them, refined them, burned away everything that was unnecessary, and left behind a core of pure, focused, relentless capability that grew stronger with every setback. The coalition would develop a new strategy, deploy it with confidence, and within 3 days, find that the humans had not only countered it, but had turned it against them. After 4 months, the coalition had suffered 30% casualties and held less territory than they had controlled on day 1. The farmers and researchers of Kessler's Reach, fighting with repurposed agricultural equipment and captured weapons, had fought 4 species to a standstill and were pushing them back. But Kessler's Reach was not the adjustment. Kessler's Reach was just the trigger. The adjustment was what happened after Earth found out. I scrolled forward in the file, past the battle reports and casualty figures, to the section marked Aftermath. This was the part that the younger counselors needed to understand. This was the part that had shaped the galaxy for 80 years. When Earth's core government learned what had happened at Kessler's Reach, they did not immediately send a fleet. That surprised the coalition, and it surprised us at the council. We expected rage. We expected a rapid military response driven by the kind of ferocious protectiveness that humans were known for. Instead, Earth went quiet. For 6 weeks, there was almost no communication from their homeworld. Diplomatic channels went dark. Trade communications continued on automated schedules, but the human representatives behind them were absent, replaced by automated systems. The coalition took this as a sign of hesitation, perhaps even acceptance. Perhaps, they reasoned, the humans had calculated the cost of retaliation and decided it was not worth the investment. Several of their diplomats began drafting terms for the formal annexation of Kessler's Reach. They were wrong. Earth was not hesitating. Earth was not calculating costs. Earth was planning. And when humans planned, they planned with a thoroughness that no other species could match, because no other species had the patience, the obsessive attention to detail, and the capacity for sustained, focused, terrifying preparation that humans brought to every task they considered important. When the response came, it was not what anyone expected. Earth did not send a fleet to Kessler's Reach. The colonists, it turned out, had held the planet on their own. The coalition's forces, battered by 4 months of relentless resistance from a population 1/20th their size, had already begun a quiet withdrawal before Earth's main force even arrived in the sector. Instead, Earth sent its fleet on a tour. The file used the human term for it: diplomatic correction. Every other species in the galaxy called it the adjustment, because that word carried a weight that the human term deliberately avoided. Over the course of 6 months, Earth's unified fleet visited the homeworld of each coalition species. They did not fire a single weapon. They did not issue a single threat. They did not deliver a single ultimatum. They did not even request communication with the local governments. They simply arrived in orbit, arranged their ships in precise formation, and conducted a series of military exercises within full sensor range of each homeworld's defense grid. I remembered the reports from the Vrethan homeworld. The Vrethan had the most advanced sensor technology in the galaxy at the time, instruments so sensitive they could detect the energy signature of a single reactor core from across a solar system. They scanned the human fleet during the exercises, and the data they collected was later shared with the Council under emergency protocols. I read those reports as a young aide, and the numbers meant nothing to me. I did not have the scientific background to understand what the sensors had detected. But I understood the reaction. The Vrethan chief scientist, a being with 3 centuries of experience in advanced physics, reviewed the sensor data and submitted her resignation the same day. In her resignation letter, which was later included in the classified file, she wrote a single sentence that I have never forgotten. Our models of what is physically possible need to be discarded. The data showed weapon systems that the Vrethan could not identify, operating on principles that contradicted their understanding of energy physics. Defensive capabilities that exceeded anything in the known galaxy by a margin that their analysts refused to quantify because the numbers seemed absurd. Power signatures that suggested energy generation technology at least 2 centuries ahead of the galactic standard, possibly more. The exercises lasted 3 days at each homeworld. 3 days of watching human ships perform maneuvers that should have been impossible, deploy weapons that should not have existed, and demonstrate capabilities that reduced every military assessment we had ever made about humanity to children's guesses. When the exercises were complete, the human fleet left. No threats, no demands, no conditions, just a demonstration, clear and undeniable, and absolutely unforgettable, of what Earth had chosen not to use at Kessler's Reach. The coalition dissolved within a month. The Stenari Pact collapsed entirely, its member species disbanding their alliance and scattering to separate corners of the galaxy. The Vrethan withdrew from territorial expansion permanently and redirected their entire military budget into defensive research. The Dorsal and the Pellic signed non-aggression treaties with Earth that were still in effect 80 years later. And every species in the galaxy understood, from that day forward, exactly what Earth was. I closed the file. My hands were trembling. I was over 200 years old, and the memory of reading those reports for the first time, of standing at a viewport and watching human ships bend the laws of physics like soft metal, still made my hands shake. I looked up from my terminal. At some point while I had been reading, a small group of younger counselors had gathered around me in the corridor outside my quarters. Kellis was there, still holding his empty teacup. Counselor Prin's senior aide, a sharp-eyed Olesi named Drevin, was there, his crystalline features arranged in an expression of academic skepticism. 2 Tuvani diplomats whose names I did not remember stood behind them, their broad faces creased with concern. A Fenari liaison officer hovered at the edge of the group, her green skin pale with anxiety. Drevin spoke first. Counselor Soros, we have all read the summary files on the adjustment. We understand that it was a significant military demonstration. But that was 80 years ago. Human technology was arguably inferior to galactic standard at the time of Kessler's Reach. They fought a colonial defense with militia forces and improvised weapons. They have been isolated from major conflicts ever since. Surely, in the intervening decades, the balance of power has shifted. Our own military capabilities have advanced enormously. I looked at him. He was young, brilliant, ambitious, well-educated, and young. He had the confidence of someone who had studied the data and drawn logical conclusions from carefully curated summaries. He had the certainty of someone who had never watched a human fleet rewrite the laws of physics from a viewport. I pulled up a single data point on my terminal and turned it so they could all see. It was Earth's current publicly available military budget, the number they reported voluntarily to the Galactic Commerce Registry every fiscal cycle, the number that every species could look up at any time, if they bothered to look. The figure was 8 times larger than it had been during the adjustment. I watched their faces change. Dreven's confidence cracked like thin glass, a network of fine lines spreading across his certainty until the whole structure gave way. Kellis set down his teacup with a soft click that sounded very loud in the silent corridor. One of the Tuvani diplomats made a sound that, in their species, was the equivalent of a prayer. The Fenari liaison took a step backward. "That is their public budget," I said. "The number they choose to share with the rest of the galaxy. The number they are not required to report accurately. Would anyone like to speculate about what they do not share?" Nobody spoke. The corridor was so quiet I could hear the hum of the station's environmental systems, the soft pulse of air being filtered and recirculated, the mechanical heartbeat of a structure that housed 1,000,000 beings from 100 worlds. "At Kessler's Reach," I continued, "they fought a 4-month war with a colonial militia. No fleet support, no advanced weapons, no strategic command structure, just 40,000 farmers and scientists who refused to lose, and they won. The adjustment showed us what their actual military could do, with weapons that were outdated by their own standards. That was 80 years ago, with a budget 1/8 of what they spend today, using technology they considered old. If you can look at those numbers and tell me that the balance of power has shifted in our favor, I would very much like to hear your reasoning." The silence in the corridor was absolute. Even the hum of the station seemed to fade, as if the structure itself was listening. Then my communication device activated, and the priority alarm sounded again, the second time that night, the second time in 80 years. I answered the call. It was Tasik, the communications director, and his voice was strained to the point of breaking. "Counselor Soros, Earth's ambassador has just submitted a formal request for a session with the full Galactic Council. Not a private meeting. Not a back-channel discussion. A formal, recorded, on-the-record session in the Grand Chamber." I closed my eyes. Around me, I heard the younger counselors reacting, heard the sharp intakes of breath, the muttered exclamations in 6 languages. When I asked the question, I already knew the answer. "When?" "Tomorrow. First light of the day cycle." She was very specific about the timing. First light. The humans had chosen to address the galaxy at dawn. In my culture, first light was the hour of reckoning, the hour when debts were called and judgments were delivered. I did not know if it carried the same meaning in theirs, but the precision of the request told me that it was not coincidental. I opened my eyes and looked at the young faces around me. They were afraid. Good, they should have been. "Go to your quarters," I told them. "Rest if you can. Tomorrow, the humans are going to tell us what they have decided, and whatever they say, the galaxy will be different afterward." They dispersed quickly, quietly, like prey animals who had caught the scent of something large moving through the forest. I stood alone in the corridor and stared at the wall, and I tried to prepare myself for what was coming. I could not prepare. No one could prepare for humans. That was the entire problem. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my quarters and reviewed every file, every report, every scrap of data I had accumulated over 2 centuries of watching humanity from across the diplomatic divide. I reviewed their history, which was a catalog of violence and resilience and reinvention that no other species could match. I reviewed their biology, which was unremarkable by galactic standards, in almost every way, except for one detail that every xenobiologist who studied them flagged as significant. Humans were endurance predators. Their ancestors, millions of years ago, had hunted by simply following their prey, on foot, for hours and days, until the prey collapsed from exhaustion. They did not need to be faster. They did not need to be stronger. They did not need to be more dangerous. They just needed to not stop. And they never stopped. That was the lesson of Kessler's Reach. That was the lesson of the adjustment. That was the lesson that every species in the galaxy had learned, and that the Krael Dominion, in their arrogance, had apparently forgotten. Humans never stopped. Morning came. The day cycle lights activated across Central Station, brightening from the deep blue of simulated night to the warm gold of simulated dawn. I dressed in my formal robes for only the fourth time in my career. The other three occasions had been the inauguration of new council members, the signing of the Accord's founding charter, and the funeral of my predecessor. Each had been a moment that marked a dividing line between what came before and what came after, a point in time where the shape of the future changed. Today would be another. The Grand Chamber was full when I arrived, not just the councilors. Every observer gallery was packed to capacity. Diplomatic staff from species that had not attended a formal session in decades were crowded into the upper levels, pressed together in configurations that would have been considered rude under normal circumstances. Media drones from 100 different worlds hovered in designated zones, their lenses trained on the central floor. The air was thick with the mixed atmospheres of 17 species, each breathing apparatus adding its own chemical signature to the recycled air, until the room smelled like the inside of a laboratory. I took my seat. Around me, the senior counselors sat in rigid silence. Counselor Bach had stopped pacing. His tail was coiled tightly around the base of his chair, a sign of extreme tension in his species. Counselor Prin's 4 eyes were fixed on the main entrance, unblinking, her crystal skin pulsing with a faint, irregular light. Even old Shorath was sitting perfectly still in her life support cradle, her ancient hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. The main doors opened. Claire Harmon walked into the grand chamber, and behind her came 3 people I had never seen before. 2 of them were military. I knew this immediately, not because of their bearing or their posture, though both were impeccable, but because of their uniforms. They wore black from head to toe, a deep matte black that seemed to absorb the chamber's light rather than reflect it. The fabric had a quality I could not describe, a density, a weight, a presence that made the air around them seem thinner. The uniforms bore no rank insignia that I could identify, no unit markings, no decorations, no awards. Just a single emblem on the left shoulder, rendered in dark gray against the black fabric, a circle enclosing a stylized sun with 8 rays extending outward. I did not recognize the emblem. I activated my terminal's database and searched for it. No results. No matches anywhere in the Galactic Accord's comprehensive military records, which cataloged the insignia and organizational structure of every known military force in the galaxy. Whatever organization these officers belonged to, whatever force they represented, we had never heard of it. The third person in Claire's delegation was a civilian, a young man with light brown hair and glasses, carrying a data tablet. He looked like a researcher, unremarkable in every way, the kind of person you would pass in a corridor and forget immediately. They walked to the speaker's platform in the center of the chamber. Claire moved with the calm confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times. The military officers flanked her, taking positions at precise distances that I recognized from my studies of human body language as a protective formation. They were not just escorts, they were guards. And the way they scanned the chamber, the way their eyes moved from face to face and door to door with cool, systematic, unhurried attention, told me that they were very, very good at what they did. I noticed something else. The counselors from predator species, beings with natural weapons, claws, teeth, venom glands, bioluminescent threat displays designed to intimidate prey, were leaning away from the 2 officers in black. Not dramatically, not obviously, but consistently, unconsciously, instinctively. Every predator in the room had identified the 2 humans as a greater threat than themselves, and their bodies were responding accordingly, pulling away from the danger the way a hand pulls away from heat. My aide Kellis leaned toward me and whispered. I asked the intelligence division about the shoulder emblem. They found one reference, buried in an intercepted human communication from 12 years ago. The organization is called Solar Command. The abbreviation is Solcom. There is no other information available. I had never heard the name. I looked at Kellis, and he shook his head. Nobody had heard the name. Earth had maintained an entire military branch, fully staffed and fully operational, that the galaxy did not know existed. For how long, I could not guess. Years, decades, perhaps since before the adjustment. Claire Harmon reached the speaker's platform and paused. She looked up at the assembled counselors, the packed galleries, the hovering media drones. She took a single breath, straightened her shoulders almost imperceptibly, and then she began to speak. Honored members of the Galactic Council, I am here today at the request of my government to address a matter of urgent humanitarian concern. She paused, letting the word land. Humanitarian, a human word, drawn from their own language, with no direct translation in galactic standard. The closest equivalent was species welfare, but that was thin and bureaucratic and missed the point entirely. Humanitarian implied something broader, something that extended beyond the boundaries of one's own kind, something that recognized suffering as suffering, regardless of who was doing it. 3 days ago, she continued, this embassy received a plea for military assistance from a representative of the Fenari Compact. The plea described conditions on Fenari Colony 7 that my government considers to be consistent with systematic extermination of civilian populations. She nodded to the young analyst, who activated the data tablet. A holographic display materialized above the speaker's platform, filling the chamber with light and color and data. The images and figures that appeared were intelligence reports, but not our intelligence reports. These were detailed, comprehensive, meticulously organized, and marked with classification headers in a human language I could not read. Over the past 24 months, Claire said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence of the chamber, Earth has maintained an independent monitoring operation in the Cryol War Zone. The results of this operation have been compiled and are being shared with the Council today. The chamber reacted, not with the explosive panic of the previous night, but with something quieter and worse. A slow, spreading realization, like cold water soaking through cloth. Earth had been watching the war for 2 years. 2 years of silent observation. 2 years of data collection. 2 years of watching the Cryol advance and the Accord retreat, and the smaller species burn, and choosing to say nothing. They had assets in the war zone. They had intelligence networks operating inside Cryol-controlled territory. They had been monitoring communications, tracking fleet movements, mapping supply lines, documenting everything. And nobody had detected them. Not us, not the Cryol, not anyone. The scale of the intelligence failure was staggering, but it was the implications that made my throat tighten. If they could watch unseen for 2 years, what else could they do? Claire continued her presentation. She was calm, systematic, precise, methodical, delivering information with the clinical detachment of a surgeon describing an operation. The Cryol Dominion's campaign was not merely territorial expansion. It was deliberate, organized, systematic elimination of civilian populations on occupied worlds. She showed evidence from 14 different planets, gathered by human assets that we had never known existed, analyzed by human systems we could not replicate, verified through methods we could not identify. The evidence was devastating, not because it was new. Many of us suspected what the Cryol were doing. Some of us knew. But we had buried the knowledge under layers of diplomatic language and strategic calculations, and the simple, shameful math of deciding that confronting the Cryol about their conduct was not worth the military cost. The humans had not buried anything. They had documented every detail, cataloged every incident, built a case so thorough and so undeniable that no counselor in the chamber could look away from it. When she finished presenting the evidence, she paused again. The chamber was silent. The media drones hung motionless in the air. The holographic display pulsed gently above the platform, its data still visible, still damning, still impossible to ignore. Based on this evidence, Claire said, and in response to the plea received from the Fenari Compact, the government of Earth formally offers military assistance to the Galactic Accord in its conflict with the Cryol Dominion. She framed it as an offer, a partnership, a request for cooperation. But the way she delivered it, the way the 2 Solcom officers stood behind her like pillars of black stone, the way the intelligence data hovered in the air in damning detail, the way every word she spoke carried the quiet certainty of someone who had already made a decision and was simply informing others of the outcome, made the reality perfectly clear. Earth intended to act, The offer of partnership was a courtesy, a chance for the accord to be on the right side of what was coming, rather than standing in the way. I stood before I knew I was going to stand. The chamber turned to look at me, and I saw surprise on many faces. The old counselor, rising to speak in response to the human ambassador. They expected me to accept. They expected gratitude, relief, a dignified statement of welcome. They expected me to be the voice of reason that ushered Earth into the war and saved the galaxy. I did not give them that. I spoke directly to Claire, ignoring the protocol that required me to address the chamber at large. I spoke to her because she was the only person in the room who might understand what I was about to say. Ambassador Harmon, I have served this council for over 200 years. I have witnessed the adjustment. I know, perhaps better than anyone in this chamber, what human military intervention means. I have seen it. I have lived in its shadow for 8 decades, and I am asking you, not as a counselor, but as someone who has seen what your species is capable of, to reconsider. The chamber stirred. Confused murmurs rippled through the galleries. Counselor Bach stared at me with undisguised shock. Counselor Prin's 4 eyes widened. Even Shorath looked up from her folded hands with an expression that might have been surprise, or might have been the grim recognition of someone who understood exactly what I was doing. I continued. We are losing this war. That is not a secret. The Krael are advancing, and our defenses are failing, and every day more worlds fall, and more people die. If we accept Earth's offer, we will win. I do not doubt that for a moment. Earth will deploy its forces, and the Krael will be defeated, and the war will end. But I need every person in this chamber to understand what that victory will look like. I need them to understand the cost. Not in ships or resources or strategic assets, in memory. I turned to face the assembled counselors. I looked at their faces, predator and prey, ancient and young, all of them desperate, all of them afraid, all of them hoping for someone to tell them that everything was going to be fine. We are losing this war slowly, I said. If we accept Earth's help, we will win it quickly. And then we will spend the next century remembering how we won it. The silence that followed was the deepest I had ever experienced in the Grand Chamber. And then the vote was called. It was not my decision. The council operated by majority, and the majority was desperate. The Fenari delegate voted first, his green skin flushed with emotion, his voice cracking but clear. In favor. The Gorvan delegation followed, their deep voices rumbling through the chamber. In favor. Then the Tuvani, then the Shivan, then the Olesi, the Dranathi, the Pelik, the Vrethan, one by one, 17 species voting to accept Earth's offer of military assistance. The vote was unanimous. I voted in favor as well. Not because I had changed my mind, because I knew that the people on Fenari Colony 7 were dying in the dark, and whatever nightmares Earth would bring to the Krael, they could not be worse than what was already happening on those occupied worlds. Principle was a luxury that dying people could not afford. The session ended. The chamber began to empty. Claire Harmon and her delegation moved toward the exit, surrounded by a bubble of empty space that every other diplomat instinctively maintained. As they passed my seat, one of the Solcom officers paused. He was young, perhaps 30 by human standards, with a calm face and steady brown eyes. He looked at me with an expression that I could not read, and then he spoke. Counselor Soros. His voice was quiet, pitched for my ears only. My name is Ethan Marsh. I have read your species classified file on the adjustment. I want you to know that what you witnessed 80 years ago was us being restrained. We will not be restrained with the Krael. He held my gaze for a moment, and there was something in his eyes that was not a threat, and not a warning, and not bravado. It was a promise. Then he walked away, following his ambassador through the doors and out of the chamber. I sat in my chair. Around me, the grand chamber emptied. Aides collected documents. Maintenance drones began cleaning the floors. The lights adjusted back to standard levels. I did not move for a long time. Restrained. The adjustment. The single most terrifying display of military power in galactic history. The event that had shaped the politics of 1,000 worlds for 80 years. The demonstration that had caused a chief scientist to resign and an entire species to abandon territorial expansion forever, had been restraint. And now, for the first time in 80 years, the humans were going to stop being restrained. I sat in my chair, alone in the emptying chamber, and I waited. And I tried very hard not to imagine what was coming. I did not have to wait long. 14 days. That is how long it took Earth to end a war that had been burning across the galaxy for 3 years. 14 days. I watched the entire campaign from the Council's War Monitoring Center, a secure facility buried in the core of Central Station, where real-time data from every active theater was displayed on a wall of holographic screens, stretching from floor to ceiling. For 3 years, this room had been a place of slow, grinding despair, where we watched the Krail advance system by system, while our forces fought and fell and retreated and died. For 14 days, it became something else entirely, something that none of us had a word for. On the first day, the Solcom fleet arrived at the forward staging area that the Accord's Combined Defense Authority had prepared. Every military analyst on the station had been speculating about the size of Earth's deployment. The Krail had over 6,000 warships spread across the front. Our own combined fleet numbered roughly 4,000, most of them damaged, many of them held together by emergency repairs and the stubbornness of their crews. The estimates for Earth's contribution ranged from 500 to 2,000 ships, depending on which analyst you asked and how optimistic they were feeling. Solcom arrived with 187 vessels. The monitoring center went silent. I watched the expressions of the military officers and analysts who staffed the room, watched the color drain from their faces, watched their hands freeze over their consoles. Counselor Bach, who had been watching from the observation platform beside me, made a sound I had never heard from a Tuvani, something between a laugh and a sob. 187 ships, against thousands. We had staked the fate of the galaxy on a species that had brought fewer ships than most single-species patrol fleets. I said nothing. I watched the displays and waited. I had learned, over 80 years, that the gap between what humans appeared to bring and what they actually delivered was the most dangerous space in the galaxy. On the second day, the Solcom fleet split into 31 independent strike groups, each consisting of between 4 and 8 ships. They dispersed across the war zone in a pattern that our tactical computers flagged as random, uncoordinated, and strategically meaningless. Our senior military analyst, a Gorvan officer named Kreshvar who had 60 years of combat experience, recommended recalling the human fleet for integration into the Accord's defensive formation. He argued that 187 ships scattered across 400 light-years of space would accomplish nothing except getting themselves destroyed. I overruled him, not because I understood what the humans were doing, because I had learned that when you did not understand what humans were doing, the correct response was to stay out of their way. On the third day, the strike groups began hitting targets. Not Krail warships, not Krail fortifications, not the frontline positions where the Krail's main battle fleets were deployed in massive, intimidating concentrations that had been slowly crushing our defenses for 3 years. They hit supply depots, communication relays, fuel processing stations, navigation beacons, maintenance yards, water purification facilities. The small, unglamorous, invisible infrastructure that nobody paid attention to, and that held the entire Krail war machine together, the way bones held together a body. 31 simultaneous strikes, spread across 400 light-years of space, each one hitting a different target with surgical precision, each one arriving and departing so quickly that the Krail barely registered what had happened before it was over. The Krail High Command barely noticed. Their admirals were focused on the front lines, where the Accord's combined fleet was maintaining a defensive position. The loss of a few supply depots was an annoyance, not a crisis. Their reports described the strikes as minor harassment operations by an insignificant force. They did not adjust their strategy. They did not reinforce their supply lines. They did not take the 187 ships seriously. By the 5th day, they should have. I watched the data feeds as the Krail's logistics network began to collapse. Without supply depots, their forward fleets could not replenish ammunition or repair battle damage. Without communication relays, their admirals could not coordinate across the front or share intelligence about human movements. Without fuel processing stations, their ships could not travel between systems at combat speed. Without navigation beacons, Their fleet movements slowed as navigators were forced to calculate routes manually. Each individual loss was manageable. Together, compounding day after day, they were devastating. The strike groups had not attacked the Krael's sword. They had severed the tendons in their sword arm. On the sixth day, the Krael dispatched a pursuit fleet, 600 warships, pulled from the front lines, tasked with finding and destroying the human strike groups that were dismantling their infrastructure. 600 ships, chasing 31 groups of 4 to 8 vessels across a war zone spanning hundreds of light years. They never caught a single one. I watched the pursuit unfold on the monitoring wall, and I understood then why 80 years of fear had not been enough. The human ships moved with a fluidity that defied every model of fleet tactics in our databases. They appeared at one location, struck a target in minutes, sometimes in seconds, and vanished before the Krael pursuit fleet could respond. Their faster-than-light transitions were impossibly precise, dropping them exactly where they needed to be, with zero detectable margin of error. Our own best navigators considered a transition accuracy of within 10,000 kilometers to be excellent. The human ships were arriving within meters of their intended coordinates. Kreshvar, the senior analyst, stopped making recommendations after the 5th day. He simply watched the displays, his massive hands resting on the console, his expression shifting from disbelief to something that I recognized as professional humility. He had spent 60 years studying warfare. In 5 days, the humans had invalidated everything he knew. On the 7th day, the Krael's frontline fleets began experiencing critical shortages. Ships that had been holding position for weeks, expecting regular resupply, found their ammunition reserves depleted and their fuel cells approaching empty. Commanders who had been coordinating across hundreds of light years found themselves isolated, unable to contact neighboring fleets, unable to verify intelligence, unable to request support. The massive, overwhelming force that had been crushing the Accord for 3 years was still physically intact, still outnumbering the human fleet by a ratio of more than 30 to 1, and it was grinding to a halt. On the 8th day, the Krael attempted to negotiate. Their supreme commander sent a direct communication to Solcom's flagship, requesting terms for a ceasefire. The response came from a human officer whose name was not in any of our records. The message was short and delivered in a tone that I recognized, from my studies of human communication patterns, as absolute, non-negotiable finality. Release all occupied worlds. Withdraw to pre-war borders. Surrender all military commanders involved in civilian operations for tribunal. You have 72 hours to comply. The Krael Supreme Commander rejected the terms. He called them absurd. He pointed out that the Krael still held 63 systems and commanded thousands of warships. He stated that no force of fewer than 200 ships could dictate terms to the Dominion. He offered a counterproposal, a limited ceasefire, a negotiated withdrawal from certain systems, a promise to review the treatment of civilian populations. The human response was silence. Complete, absolute silence. No counteroffer, no negotiation, no further communication of any kind. The 72 hours expired on the 11th day. At exactly the moment the deadline passed, not a second before and not a second after, Solcom executed an operation that our analysts are still trying to understand. Every Krael military shipyard in their home territory was hit simultaneously. All 17 of them, not within minutes of each other, not within seconds. Simultaneously, across a span of 400 light-years, 17 targets were struck at the exact same instant. The monitoring center erupted. Analysts shouted over each other. Tactical displays flickered and recalibrated as the data poured in. Kreshvar stood up from his console and stared at the wall of screens with an expression that had gone beyond shock into something closer to awe. Our physicists could not explain the coordination. Our communications experts could not explain how the timing had been achieved. The distances involved made simultaneous action physically impossible, according to every known model of faster-than-light communication and travel. Light itself could not have carried a signal between those 17 points fast enough to coordinate the strikes, and yet it had happened. 17 shipyards, the backbone of the Krael's ability to build and repair warships, the foundation of their long-term military capability, destroyed in a single coordinated blow that should not have been possible according to any physics we understood. I stood at the observation platform and watched the data cascade across the screens, and I understood something that I had known intellectually for 80 years, but had never truly felt in my bones. We did not understand what humans were capable of. We had never understood. The adjustment, the classified files, the intelligence estimates, the eightfold budget increase, all of it was guesswork. We were children trying to map the ocean by studying the waves on the shore. On the 12th day, the Krael's frontline fleets began surrendering. Not retreating, surrendering. Without shipyards, their damaged vessels could not be repaired. Without supplies, their crews could not eat. Without communications, their admirals could not coordinate, or even confirm that their government still existed. Without fuel, they could not move. They faced a simple choice: give up or drift in the void until their life support systems failed. Most of them chose to give up. I watched the surrender transmissions come in on the monitoring wall, one after another, Krael commanders speaking in flat, defeated voices, transmitting their coordinates and powering down their weapons, and waiting for someone to come and collect them. Some of them sounded relieved. Some of them sounded broken. All of them sounded like beings who had suddenly realized that the war they thought they were fighting was not the war that had actually been fought. On the 13th day, the Krael's supreme commander attempted to flee. His flagship, a massive dreadnought that had been the symbol of Krael military power for decades, broke from the Dominion's core territory and made a run for the Galactic Rim, accompanied by a personal escort of 40 warships. It was not a tactical withdrawal, it was a desperate flight, a commander abandoning his forces and his people in a last, frantic attempt to escape the consequences of a war he had already lost. Solcom intercepted them with a single ship. One ship, against 41. The engagement lasted 20 minutes. When it was over, the Krael flagship and its entire escort were disabled. Not destroyed, but completely and utterly unable to move, fight, or flee. Their weapons were offline. Their engines were cold. Their shields were down. They floated in the void like stones dropped into still water, inert and helpless, surrounded by the fading energy signatures of systems that had been shut down by means our analysts could not identify. Kreshvar watched the engagement data scroll across his console. When it ended, he quietly removed his rank insignia and set it on the console in front of him. I asked him why. He said that he no longer felt qualified to call himself a military professional. He said that what he had just witnessed was not warfare as he understood it. He said that it was something else, something that his training and his experience and his 60 years of service had not prepared him for. On the 14th day, the Krael Dominion surrendered unconditionally. 14 days, 3 years of war, 63 occupied systems, millions of casualties, billions of displaced civilians, the worst conflict in galactic history since the founding of the Accord, and it ended in 14 days. The monitoring center emptied slowly over the following hours. The staff drifted away in ones and twos, many of them looking dazed, some of them simply sitting at their stations and staring at the screens where the word surrender was displayed in the Krael's own angular script. A few of them were crying, not from sadness, from relief, from shock, from the overwhelming cognitive dissonance of watching the impossible happen and having to accept that it had happened. I remained at the observation platform. I had not left the monitoring center in 3 days. I had not eaten. I had barely slept. I stood and stared at the screens and tried to process what I had witnessed, and I failed. There was no framework for it, no precedent, no language in any species' vocabulary that could adequately describe what 187 ships had done to a civilization that commanded thousands. The door to the monitoring center opened behind me. I heard footsteps, human footsteps, the distinctive rhythm that I had learned to recognize over 2 centuries. Claire Harmon walked to the observation platform and stood beside me. She was still wearing her formal suit, now wrinkled and slightly rumpled, the collar loosened, the small pin of Earth's government slightly askew on her lapel. She looked tired, not triumphant, not proud, tired, the way someone looks after completing a task they wish they had never had to do. We stood in silence for a long time, watching the screens, watching the data feeds update with the latest reports from the liberated worlds, watching the status of the Krael forces change one by one from hostile to surrendered. Then I asked her the question that had been building inside me since this began. Not since the Finari plea. Not since the emergency alarm. Since the adjustment. Since 80 years ago, when I stood at a viewport as a young aide and watched human ships perform exercises that made a chief scientist resign and an entire species give up territorial expansion forever. You could have ended this 2 years ago, I said. You were watching. You had assets in the war zone. You had the capability. We both know that. Why did you wait? Claire did not answer immediately. She looked at the screens, at the aftermath of a war that her species had ended in 2 weeks, and her expression was not what I expected. It was not satisfaction, or relief, or even sadness. It was something private, something deeply internal, something that existed in a space I could not reach and did not have a word for. Because the last time we acted without being asked, she said slowly, choosing each word the way her species always did, with care and weight and an awareness of consequence, the galaxy called it the adjustment and built a religion of fear around us. We spent 80 years being the monster in the dark, the species that other civilizations warn their children about, the reason that every embassy on this station steps aside when we walk past, the reason that a delegation of senior diplomats came to my door in the middle of the night, not to ask for help, but to beg us to do nothing. She paused. Her voice, when she continued, was quiet and carefully controlled, and there was something in it that I had never heard from a human before, something that sounded like loneliness. We waited for someone to ask, she said. We waited for someone to look at what was happening on those occupied worlds and decide that our help was worth having, that we were worth trusting. We did not want to be feared into this war. We wanted to be invited. I stood beside her and let those words settle into me. I thought about the Finari delegate, the terrified young creature who had broken every protocol in the book and sent an unauthorized plea to the one species the galaxy feared most. I thought about the children on Finari Colony 7, starving in underground shelters, while the surface above them burned. I thought about the 80 years of silence between Earth and the rest of the galaxy, 80 years of fear and distance, and carefully maintained separation, 80 years of treating the most capable species in the galaxy as something to be contained rather than engaged. And I thought about Claire Harmon, sitting in her warm embassy surrounded by growing things and music and teacups sized for other species' hands, waiting for someone, anyone, to walk through her door and ask for help. She had not been calm that night when I visited her embassy. She had been waiting. Waiting with the terrible patience that humans possessed, the endurance predator patience that could sustain them through hours and days and years of pursuit. Waiting for a signal that might never come. And when the plea came, not from the council, not from the senior diplomats, not from the species with powerful fleets and ancient traditions, but from a single desperate junior delegate who broke protocol because he could not bear to watch his people die, she had answered. Because that was what humans did. They answered. I looked at Claire, and for the first time in 80 years, I saw a human clearly. Not as a weapon, not as a monster, not as the architect of the adjustment or the commander of the impossible fleet that had just dismantled a galactic power in 14 days. I saw a person. Tired and relieved and carrying the weight of choices that no one should have to make alone, standing in a room full of screens that showed the aftermath of a war she had ended, and a galaxy she had saved, and that would probably spend the next century being afraid of her for it. Thank you, I said. She looked at me with surprise, genuine, unguarded surprise, the first truly readable expression I had ever seen on a human face. Not for the war, I said, for waiting. For letting someone ask, for trusting us enough to let us make the choice ourselves, even when waiting meant watching people suffer. She smiled. It was a small, tired smile, nothing like the bright warmth she had shown in the embassy, but it was real. It was the most real thing I had ever seen from a human. Go home, counselor, she said. Sleep. Tomorrow there will be a great deal of paperwork, and I suspect your council will want to have several hundred meetings about what happens next. She turned and walked away. I watched her go, this small human woman who represented a species that could end wars in weeks, and had chosen to wait years for an invitation. She walked through the door and disappeared into the corridor, and I stood alone in the monitoring center, surrounded by the fading light of screens that told the story of the fastest military campaign in galactic history. I stayed for another hour. Then I returned to my quarters. I did not sleep. Instead, I sat at my desk and began to draft a document. Not a warning file, not a restriction protocol, not a classified briefing with a red seal and a single-word header. I drafted a formal council resolution proposing that Earth be offered a permanent seat on the Galactic Accord. Not as an observer, not as a military ally to be called upon in emergencies and then sent back to the shadows, as a full member, a partner, an equal voice in the decisions that shape the future of every civilization in the galaxy. I did not know if they would accept. 80 years of being treated as the galaxy's worst nightmare, 80 years of empty corridors and averted eyes and diplomatic quarantine might have made them cautious, might have made them bitter, might have convinced them that the distance was safer than the trust, that being feared was less painful than being close enough to be rejected. But I thought about Claire Harmon, waiting in her embassy for someone to ask. I thought about Ethan Marsh, telling me that the adjustment was restraint, his eyes carrying a promise instead of a threat. I thought about 40,000 colonists on Kessler's Reach, who refused to stop fighting because it was their home and they would not give it up. I thought about 187 ships against 6,000 and the 14 days that changed everything. I thought about what it meant to be human, not the strength, not the technology, not the impossible fleets and the incomprehensible weapons, and the physics-defying coordination that our best scientists could not explain. What it meant beneath all of that, the stubbornness, the refusal to look away from suffering, the willingness to act when action was needed, even when the cost was high, even when the galaxy would fear them for it, the patience to wait until they were wanted, rather than simply imposing themselves on a universe that did not understand them. 80 years of fear was enough. It was time to try something else. I finished the draft as the day cycle lights brightened toward morning. I saved the file and sat back in my chair, and for the first time since the alarm had woken me, I felt something other than dread. I felt the beginning of hope. Tomorrow I would present the resolution to the council. Tomorrow, the arguments would begin. Some species would resist. Some would cling to the fear that had defined their relationship with Earth for generations. Some would insist that keeping humans at arm's length was the only safe course, that the adjustment proved they could not be trusted with proximity, that the Cryol campaign proved they were too powerful to be allowed into the inner circle of galactic governance. I would listen to those arguments. I would understand them, and then I would stand, as I had stood the night the alarm sounded, as I had stood in the grand chamber when the vote was called, and I would speak. I would tell them about Claire Harmon's teacups, sized for Shivan hands, about the plants growing on the walls of an embassy that could have been a fortress, about a species that had the power to end a war in 14 days and had spent 2 years waiting for someone to ask for help, about an ambassador who had sat alone in a warm room, surrounded by growing things, listening to music and making tea, while the galaxy burned around her, because she was waiting for an invitation that she was not sure would ever come. I would tell them that the galaxy had spent 80 years being afraid of humanity, and that in all that time, humans had not given us a single reason to be afraid. We had given ourselves reasons. We had built the fear out of our own guilt and our own insecurity and our own inability to understand a species that did not operate by the mathematics we considered universal. We had maintained the fear because it was easier to be afraid of humans than to admit that we needed them. It was easier to call them monsters than to call them neighbors. I would tell them that fear was a choice, and that today, I was choosing differently. And then I would ask them to vote. I set down my terminal and closed my eyes. Outside my quarters, Central Station hummed with the quiet machinery of a galaxy that was waking up to a new reality. Somewhere out there, on 63 worlds that had been under occupation for months or years, people were emerging from shelters and looking up at skies that were clear for the first time in living memory. Somewhere out there, human ships were standing guard over populations they had never met, protecting species they had no obligation to protect, because someone had asked them to, and they had said yes. And somewhere, in an embassy at the end of a long corridor, behind a plain gray door that hid a room full of growing things and warmth and music, Claire Harmon was probably making tea, not because anyone was coming, just because it was morning, and that was what you did in the morning. And maybe, eventually, someone would knock. I smiled. It was a small smile, tired and uncertain, and carrying the weight of 2 centuries of memory, and the faint, fragile possibility that the next 2 centuries might be different. But it was a start.